thank Ida Ojano, Mariana Castiglione for the kind invitation to participate at this interesting webinar. This occasion pushed me to deepen the topic of Phoenician and Punic imagery of Sardinia from the choroplastic perspective, and it represents an opportunity to show an overview of the current state of knowledge. The focus of this presentation will be on gynomorphic figurines dating basically from the 7th to the 5th century BC. To this period refers some Oriental iconographic types, but also Greek-influenced images that represent votaries, musicians, or possible representation of deities themselves that have been found mainly in necropolis and shrines. It is not easy to draw a complete picture of the documentation from Sardinia. At this time, a comprehensive review of choroplastic production is unfortunately lacking. One of the main problems related to the study of the statuettes and their interpretation is due to the relative context and chronology. The history and the vicissitudes of the excavation in the main Phoenician Punic settlements, which began toward the end of the 19th century and from which come the greater number of individuals, led to the loss of fundamental contextual and chronological data. Other problem is based on the difficulty to finding terracottas. Some ones are only mentioned in excavation reports, while many others are still waiting publication. Furthermore, only a small number of the figurines ended up in various museums and private collections are published in the exhibition catalogs or in the reference monograph published since 1917 by Sabatino Moscati and his pupils. However, are noteworthy the recent and important works by Adriano Singer and Chiara Fariselli and Mireia Lopez that have focused on the so-called grinning mask or bottle-shaped suffering, devotees. In a brief way, between the 7th and the 5th centuries BC, the documentation now shows how the variety of the imaginary appears somewhat limited, both numerically and typologically. In fact, some highly characterizing types are missing, such as pregnant woman and daily life scenes that were documented in the central Mediterranean, for example, in Carthage. In this period, the main influence in productions have been identified largely in the East. There are types such as male bearded heads, masked protomes, and still others that you can see in the slide that could originally be traced back to the Cyprus or to the Levantine coast, but which have had a much wider distribution in the West. In the centuries, the figurative repertoire or Oriental derivation produced by local workshops and artisans took also particular and unique characteristics like those of Bithynia and Neapolis because of the strong persistence of the artistic, social, and cultural tradition of the Sardinian Nuragic population. From the 5th century and especially between the 4th and the 2nd century BC, there is an exceptional increase in evidence. The repertoire was enriched with a remarkable variety of models inspired by Greek and Hellenistic production that result in such types as the seated goddesses, temple boys, cruciform figures, or the well-known incense burner documented very widely throughout the island. By focusing our attention in the 10 proposals of this webinar, our overview will begin with the plaques depicting standing woman, both dressed and undressed, made in a uniball mold. The first type consists in standing and naked females touching their breast. The belly is slightly curved. These figurines are well known in both in North Phoenician and Cyprus and go back to the 7th century BC and beyond to the Bronze Age. In Sardinia is documented only in 2 specimens. The one from Nora, which missing legs, measure 20 centimeters height and date from the early 17th century BC. This chronology seems to be indicated by the general similarity to other facial features and hairstyle, as well as the generical appearance of the naked body of clay figurines from Tencastel and from some bronze come from the Levantine coast. A second example, dates to the beginning of the 6th century, was recovered in Darros, which is nowadays on display in the British Museum of London. Black coloration can still be seen on the hair, and these traces on painting are evidence of ancient coloring, which was probably a common feature. As we can see in other cases from Cyprus and from other Levantine sites, the women holding their breasts have received a decoration and were depicted with elaborate jewelry, including an intricate necklaces and armlets. If we look further in Sardinian documentation, the image that represents woman holding her breast exists also in gold and ivory. We can also observe this type of representation in stone materials, such as the stele from the Tophet sanctuary of Sulki, dated back to the second half of 7th century BC. In terms of iconography, as noted earlier, for many scholars, the nudity, the gesture, and sometimes the addition of the Egyptian crowns are generally understood as divine. In fact, these images are usually identified as a representation of the goddess Astarte. But it's even possible that this female form might also be interpreted as a static symbol of some specific worship practices and rites, summarized and identified in the gesture of holding the breast. Breast compression is a way to gently squeeze in the breast to put pressure on milk glands, causing them to release milk. This semantic allusion to maternal milk, so accurately depicted, surely is it related to the centrality of the female liquid in sacred and funerary rituals. As proposed by Mireia Lopez and Meritxell Ferrer, it could be interpreted as a protector and regenerator element, and also a marker of life transition in Phoenician and Punic communities. The second type, dated from the 7th century BC ongoing, is known in literature as mummiform figures and shows a strong Egyptian influence. In the complete plaque from Tarrus, measuring 25 centimeters high, is depicted a frontal standing young woman showing a hairstyle that recalls the short Egyptian waist-like arrangements, and dressed in a decorated long garment with a belt. The arms hang down the sides of the body, and her feet are bare. The Wing Collection one, with the missing head, is less detailed, but it's very likely that details were painted, as can be seen in some contemporary cases found in the Carthaginian necropolis of Duims. It is quite controversial to determine if the image represents a deity or a mortal young woman. Maybe the presence of the double pedestal is an argument in favor of the interpretation relating to divinities rather than humans. It has to be highlighted as additional element that both in Carthage and Sardinia, the male version is also known. They are beardless young men wearing an Egyptian type kilt, descended. Following Idaugiano, referring to the life-size statues, this dress must be interpreted as a generic indication of a dimension that could be cultural and or indicating social prestige. As noted, it is very difficult to interpret a figure a man dressed with descended as god, genius, worshipper, or priest in the absence of the exact context. And this consideration can be equally valid from the female figurines from Sardinia. In order to better contextualize this type of images, the full publication regarding the Tom 12 PGM of Sant'Antioco, excavated by Paolo Bernardini a few years ago, will be essential. In the preliminary reports, it had been presented as a terracotta, similar to the previous ones, and dating back to the 5th century BC. We point out the details on the dress, rendered in relief, and the two holes in correspondence of the hands, which perhaps suggest the presence of some perishable material originally worn by the figure. From the 6th century, a new type of plaques inspired by Eastern Mediterranean Greek productions appear in Sardinia. These plaques represent the images of women holding a round object in front of their body, identified with a hard drum or a tympanum. All of the figurines are given in a frontal pose and are about 16 to 30 centimeters high. Attested from North Africa, Sicily, and Ibiza, Tambourine player is one among the most significant iconographies of Western Phoenician choroplastic tradition, and the background has been searched in the East, where some examples were documented in southern Phoenicia and Palestine from the 2nd and 1st millennium BC. The Sardinian corpus is composed of more than 30 figurines, 20 of them recovered from the necropolis and from the Tophet of the sanctuary of Tarros. In this site, a great diversity of types was documented. Some women standing in a pedestal wears a long plain gathered robe and headdress and has her hair over the shoulders in 3 long cords on either side. Others have a simpler dress and have no pedestal. In all cases, it's very suggestive the emphasis placed by the artisans of the movement of the hands. The left support the tambourine from below, while the right strikes it. In one case, this one on the left, impasse and stylistic affinities with contemporary Carthaginian terracottas may indicate that this specimen was imported from abroad, maybe from Carthage. By contrast, other cases, the many numbers of figurines that always share the same measures and the same formal characteristics suggest a local productions of the terracottas. This type is documented also in the necropolis of Nora, which once still showed the autonomy and variety of the types produced in Sardinian workshops. From the recent excavation in the inhabited area of Sulci, the current Sant'Antioco, there is a fragment of tambourine player, unfortunately recovered in the layers of the pavement preparation of the Roman road. This area is certainly a part of a sanctuary dedicated to the Rabat Elat during the Roman Republican period, and it is very likely that during the Phoenician and Punic time, they may have been a small sanctuary of domestic shrine, as some materials like razors, betilos, and bronze cypress stands seem to indicate. Also from Sant'Antioco, we present 2 unusual and unpublished miniatures of tambourine players. Both measure no more than 6 centimeters in height and probably come from the Tophet, as this other one miniature that you see in the lower right, which exhibits the same garment and gesture, but seems to carry small objects in each hand. For the inhabitants of the ancient Sulci, the image of female tambourine players must have had a very particular and profound meaning. It was in fact depicted on more than 300 votive stelae recovered from the Tophet sanctuary. These hundreds of female musician images will denote, as noted before, that music, songs, and also dance play a key role in the Punic rituals, and specifically highlight the woman's role in the performance of funerary and Tophet ceremonial. The females depicted in this stele, with a chronology between the 6th and the 3rd century, consents to follow the formal changes of the iconography throughout the time. From the 2nd half of 4th century, the frontal attitude is lost, and the garment will become softer and more draped. This change towards an Hellenistic form is documented also in the clay figurines, as shown by this terracotta and by the mold found in a sector of Punic inhabitants of Karali, which was located on the shores of the Santa Gilas Lagoon. And finally, to conclude our overview, a few brief words on protomes, bodiless depictions that represent the face, the hair, and part of the bust of women that have been usually interpreted as the portrait of a deity, even when the elements or distinctive gestures are missing. They appear in various Western Mediterranean sites, like Mozia and Carthage, although their iconography was already employed in the Eastern Mediterranean. In Sardinia, protomes come primarily from the necropolis. The largest groups comes again from Tarros. In this case, we can observe different stylistic changes over the time, but without losing their original significance. Other ones come from sanctuaries, from the so-called Shmun Temple of Nora and from the Acropolis of Panilorica, recently interpreted as a sacred area. The image of Panilorica is well known in Sardinia and reproduces the Egyptian style face framed by long hair, pulled behind the ears, and hanging along the shoulders, often defined as a started tribe protome. This image was used on different types of medium, for example, in gold pendants from Tarros and in the little stone hells from Cagliari. These, recovered on pre-medieval necropolis, are no higher than 13 centimeters. And as Maria Luisa Alberti notes, had a quadrangular hole in the base, useful for mounting them on a support, perhaps of wooden, which completed the figure. An exceptional example, entirely made in wood, and which retained much of the original color, come from the Punic necropolis of Sant'Antioco. Inside tomb 11, dated back from the 5th century BC, an unusual sarcophagus was discovered. On the lid was a life-size human figure in relief that reproduced the silhouette of a standing woman dressed on a specific ceremonial crotch, surely to be identified with the divinized image of the deceased. Her face, unfortunately damaged, reproduced the same image of the Egyptizing protomes, as can be seen from some details of the hair. All of them are standardized and polysemic female images that acquire very different meanings from the moment of manufacture to the final deposition in necropolis or in sanctuaries, sometimes so generic and sometimes so specific that many times we are unable to understand it without context. Thank you for the attention.